be screwed. Feel my own adrenaline, yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the 21st part of, What If Harry Potter Meets My Little Pony? Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of tkepner on fanfiction.net. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. How could anyone whose animagus form was a unicorn, that symbol of all that is good and pure, manage to do that without bursting into flames at the evilness? And 3 unicorn Animagi had participated in the ritual. The Slytherins were alternately horrified, terrified, perplexed, and disgusted. Gryffindors? What was the world coming to? Plus, what were they to make of Myrtle, herself? That evil undead abomination, now wearing her freshly laundered robes and spotlessly clean glasses. They all knew well, those in second year and above knew just what sort of unpleasant and ridiculous joke of a ghost she was. Not that any dared say that to her face. Stories still circulated among the witches of how she had terrorized her classmates by drifting through them in the dead of night, waking them by nearly freezing them, leaving them unable to warm up or sleep the rest of the night. That she had spent most of her pathetic ghostly existence crying in her toilets had been a true blessing, otherwise she could have been a terror on equal with, or even surpassing, Peeves. She was laughing and gorging herself on the food on the table as if she were starving. On the other hand, as she frequently rebuffed her critics, "It's been 48 years, 2 months, and 25 days since I've tasted fried chicken, steak, or truffle pudding. I'm allowed to make a pig of myself, don't you dare try to stop me. And take your hands off that mince pie, it's mine." The rate at which she was devouring her food was truly prodigious. Even Ron was impressed, and wondered if she was hollow inside. Harry suspected that her new body required a tremendous amount of fuel after the ritual. She was, after all, replacing a conjured body with real mass. The 3 unicorns were also starving, and already on their thirds, having lost a bit of weight in bringing Myrtle back. A number of the other Frnds in Gryffindor were also showing an unusual appetite. The spell hadn't mentioned that it was taking mass from the casters. Her seatmates on either side of her were careful to keep their fingers well out of range of her knife and fork for fear of losing something to the meat grinder that was Myrtle's mouth. Nor did they allow their hands or arms to stray between her and any of the platters she was raiding for food, for fear of being stabbed with a fork or knife. Or both. It didn't hurt that the Gryffindors backed her completely, with the twins taking bets on how much she would be able to eat and whether she would keep it down. The house elves were apparently thrilled to see someone so focused on their offerings, as new platters appeared as fast as she emptied them. Myrtle, though, certainly wasn't acting like an evil abomination. Nor did she give off any impression that evil lurked in her heart. Sitting or standing nearby did not give one the shivers of fear that such evil was said to spread by its mere presence. Nor did she glare malevolently at anyone unless they came between her and a food platter. Her blissful expression at every bite was more than a bit disconcerting. Food didn't taste that good, did it? More than one person was regarding the food on their plates with uncertain expressions, and chewing a bit slower than usual. There was no feeling that something wasn't right with her except maybe her pimples. She did have any awful lot of them. But pimples, despite how many witches felt about them, were not inherently evil, or life-consuming atrocities. She should have been moody, easy to upset, and on a hair trigger for a tantrum. At least, for those that had met her as a ghost, that's what they all said. Instead, she was downright giddy with happiness. Could that be an after effect of the ritual? Plus, she would occasionally stop and just slide her hands on her clothes or face. Or through her hair. And her eyes fairly sparkled as she looked around the great hall. The most evil thing she had said so far was that all the girls who had tormented her in Hogwarts all those years ago were now miserable ugly old hags with teats down to their knees. And she had laughed uproariously at that thought. She had had her revenge. Her plans for the evening, to all who would listen, was to spend the entire evening in the hot tub that her new Gryffindor friends had generously invited her to use. Her first real soak in, again, 48 years, 2 months, and 25 days. Maybe something in the spell itself had made her so cheerful, the students concluded outside of the obvious result of her not being dead anymore, of course. Although a few maintained that not being dead was a more than sufficient reason to be in joyous celebration. Harry could see several Ravenclaw girls eyeing their new housemate suspiciously. They seemed especially perturbed by the way Myrtle was eyeing the boys at their table, whenever she stopped eating for a moment. Plus, she frequently looked over at other houses' wizards as well. The looks she gave certain male prefects were not only inviting, but downright fiery. Harry had seen looks like those only in movies that he had managed to catch a glimpse of through the tiny holes in his cupboard door at the Dursleys' house. Usually, ones that Aunt Petunia had rented and played only when she knew both his uncle and his cousin were not going to be about for several hours and she had forgotten that her husband had exiled Harry to his cupboard yet again. He wasn't sure, exactly, what those looks meant, except that many of the witches in the Great Hall seemed to take offense at seeing it directed towards the wizards they were sitting near. The wizards, when they noticed, almost always looked away while they blushed. A very few wizards returned her looks with what Harry thought was an odd expression. So, even though Myrtle Warren was definitely not an evil abomination bent on world domination, eating others' souls, or destruction in general, she did manage to put a certain kind of fear into a large portion of the female population at Hogwarts at her area of the tables in the Great Hall. Headmaster Dumbledore watched everything with twinkling eyes while Severus scowled at the Gryffindor's Sweetie Belle seemed to be the main target of his displeasure. Phileas and Minerva alternated between being pleased at how their respective houses were reacting and worried at what might be coming in the future albeit for different reasons. Quirinus devoted his time to closely studying both Myrtle and the Atlanteans. Minerva had complained to Albus earlier, as they discussed the latest incident in his office with the other heads of houses. They had been hashing out how they were going to handle the situation with the newly reborn Myrtle. This year's Gryffindor Furs ties are showing an unusual aptitude for inventing entirely new areas of professorial concern, she had complained. I have already forbidden Gryffindor House from exorcising or assisting any ghosts to their next great adventure, which includes leaving Peeves alone, to my personal regret. On the other hand, that pronouncement has apparently earned my house a reprieve from his pranks. She had sighed. But who knows how long that will last? She sighed. The Atlantean girls, however, have expressed disappointment at losing their chance to be cutie mark crusader necromancers, she had continued, shuddering. And now, this afternoon, I had to extend that ban to include returning to life any ghosts, or other deceased individuals, whether human or not. Peeves is apparently currently in hiding, wanting no part, it seems, in being turned to corporeal form. The list, prominently posted beside the common room door so that it could not be missed while exiting the room for the rest of the castle, now had 2 new rules. 3. Students are not allowed to manifest, materialize, restore, or otherwise turn or return to life any ghosts, or other deceased or non-corporeal individuals, whether human or not. PRD. A. This includes, but is not limited to, banshees, dementors, draugrs, ghouls, jiangshis, liches, mummies, phantoms, poltergeists, revenants, shadow persons, skeletons, specters, vampires, wights, wraiths, and zombies. B. Yes, this includes Peeves, no matter how much he deserves hexing. 4. Students are not allowed to attempt spells or rituals from household grimoires or books from home without first getting permission from their head of house or the headmaster. Preferably both. A. Individual spells brought or sent from home are included in this. B. As are any spells from a source not in the Hogwarts library. C. As are any spells from books in the Hogwarts restricted section. D. And book, for the purposes of this list, shall be construed to be anything with a spell written on it. And they haven't even been at school for a full week, yet. She had concluded, shuddering to think at the mischief they would get into once they had settled in and had become used to the castle and its foibles. I never thought I would say it, but I miss when it was just the Weasley twins I had to keep an eye on. Now it's the entire Gryffindor first-year class. She had buried her head in her hands. Severus had looked almost pleased to hear of her difficulties. Plus, to Dumbledore's relief, the past day had distracted her from any more surprise hexing. Just as dinner wound down and students began to stand and leave, there was brilliant flash of light near the ceiling. A appealing melody trilled out across the hall. A phoenix had just flashed into the hall and was circling the room. It was a appealing bird with a golden feathered head, wings with leading edges of red feathers and trailing gold feathers, and a gold-feathered BRST and red-feathered back. Its long trailing tail was a mixture of both and seemed to leave a trail of gold and red shimmering behind it. The headmaster looked up and said, "Fox? I wonder what brings him here." As the bird spotted its intended target and dove straight down to Harry, Dumbledore corrected himself. "Oh, that's not Fox," he said, surprised. Almost as soon as he said that, another phoenix flashed into the room and circled. It had a red-feathered head with red feathers leading its wings. The body feathers were similar to the other phoenix. Its song, as it circled, watching the other bird, was a gorgeous and soothing counterpoint to the first one's. "Ah, that's Fox," the headmaster needlessly said. The first phoenix came to a gentle landing between Harry and Sweetie Belle's plates and dropped a scroll from one claw. It still held another. Harry looked at the scroll beside his plate and saw the Equestrian royal seal. He paled significantly. Sweetie Belle saw the seal, too, and looked at the bird. "Philomena?" she asked. The bird gave a soft trill of acknowledgement and leaned into Sweetie Belle's hand as she hesitantly started to slide it. Fox began a slow glide to the backrest on the headmaster's throne. "Well," asked Apple Bloom, "ain't you gonna open it?" Slowly, Harry picked up the scroll as if he feared it would explode in his hands, and unrolled it. The girls crowded close and he held it so all three could easily read it. Sweetie Belle offered a large chunk of roast to the phoenix before turning her attention to the letter. Hermione surreptitiously, or so she thought, vainly tried to peek. "Dear Harry Potter, Sweetie Belle, Apple Bloom, and Scootaloo. We recently received a letter from your headmaster asking if certain stories you've recounted about your experiences in Ponyville are accurate. We are writing you to let you know that we are confirming those stories so you needn't worry about being in trouble for talking about things you shouldn't." They exchanged glances. That was one bolt they had managed to dodge. Although how their relatives would enforce a grounding was an interesting question. You may tell the truth to anyone who asks about your lives in Ponyville, just so long as you do not reveal that Equestria is a different world, or that your normal form is as a pony. While our plans for an embassy are proceeding quite nicely, we are not yet ready to announce our presence publicly. On a different topic, my faithful student has told me of some of your experiences. We were quite startled and pleased to discover that you can change back to your equestrian selves while in that world. That you were able to coax the Weasley family into resuming the pony forms given to them by Discord, whom no one has seen since, except Fluttershy, speaks well of your teaching abilities. We are proud to hear that you assisted a lost soul to his final journey on the other side of the veil. Even if it was accidental, it still shows great strength of character and kindness to a creature rarely seen in Equestria. We are delighted that you met one of Woofy's counterparts. Woofy does enjoy his tummy rubs. And when he's being temperamental, nothing soothes him better than a nice lullaby puts him right to sleep. Written in small letters that curved up the side of the scroll, someone, probably Luna, had added. Which is why his post at Tartarus Gate has a soundproofing magical shield around it. And what did you think of being the opposite gender for a day? Was it interesting? And all completely by accident. What a great prank that would make. Did you manage to save any of the potion? Could you send me? Beside the crossed out me, and slightly above it was written us, underlined twice. Some. You must tell me us all about it. Twilight tells me your letters to your relatives are always the high points of their days, even if they are a bit startling. Your first week has certainly been exciting, hasn't it? We can hardly wait to hear what new experiences come your way in the next few weeks. With all our love and support. Princess Celestia. Princess Luna. After scarfing down the chunk of meat provided by Sweetie Belle, Philomena took to the air again and headed for the headmaster. She swooped low over his plate and dropped the second scroll into his soup, then flew up and around to land on his backrest beside Fox, where the two birds began a softly trilled conversation. The headmaster gave Harry and his girlfriends a quick smirk, then turned his attention to fishing the scroll out of his dinner and drying it off with a spell. Harry found that watching the old wizard's eyebrows work their way up to his forehead as he worked his way down the scroll was quite amusing. That evening, the Ollery was depopulated as wizards and witches sent missives home with the latest exploits of the mysterious foreigners, rumored to be from Atlantis, and the Gryffindor first ties with many owls carrying more than one DLVRY. And not all the mail was fixated on the Harry Potter's Phoenix and Myrtle's resurrection, except as asides to their main topic, the Gryffindors later surmised. Harry and the Fillies, reluctantly and with Philomena's assistance, sent a short scroll to the princesses detailing today's successful experiment in materializing ghosts. The only downside to the whole affair was that they hadn't gotten cutie marks for raising the dead. Then they sent their owls to their relatives and Harry sent Hedwig to Twilight. "Take your time," he said, stroking the snowy white owl gently. "No need to hurry." Sunday morning was not at all pleasant for the headmaster. Neither was the afternoon. In fact, the entire day could have been removed and Dumbledore would have been perfectly happy with that. And it was such a pity because he had been looking forward to a day when he wasn't being surreptitiously hexed by his second-in-command. His first inkling that the day wasn't going to be sunshine and roses were the green flames appearing in his fireplace as he came down the stairs to his office for breakfast. Usually, he took his breakfasts and lunches in his office, reserving the dinner hour for his benevolent appearance in the Great Hall. "Ah, Albus? Are you there?" came a hesitant voice. Albus sighed. It was Cornelius Fudge, the head of the British Ministry of Magic. A more incompetent, or corrupt, minister would be difficult to find. At the time of his election, considering the splintered political climate, he was the only choice all sides could agree upon. All the other candidates gave too much power to one side or another. The only other candidate who could win was Albus himself, and he wanted no part of the tremendous time that position entailed. Nor the people he would have to deal with on a daily basis. Children were so much easier to control and steer to the proper way of thinking. Not to mention that he didn't like the thought of being in such a position of power. The temptations to use that power were tremendous, and, without great effort, could easily slide into the realm of abuse of that power. It could lead to assuming that what he thought was the correct way was the only way, and not just ignoring dissent but treating it as a betrayal of trust. Yes, that path was fraught with perils for the weak-willed or timid. Or even the strong-minded. As he had discovered, oh, so many years ago. "Yes, Cornelius," the old wizard said quietly to the head in his fireplace. "Did you want to come through? I was just about to have my breakfast. Would you care to join me?" "Yes," Minister Fudge said, "a cup of tea would be nice. I've already had my breakfast, though." Moments later, the two were sitting down to a table at one side of the office. The minister sat down heavily into the chair across from the headmaster and set his green bowler hat on the table beside his cup. Dumbledore took a sip of his tea. "What can I do for you, Cornelius?" "I hadn't even woken up properly before I started to receive phone calls from some rather important members of our society," the minister started fussily, nervously tapping his hat's brim with one finger. Dumbledore nodded his understanding. All those owls last night had arrived at their destinations early this morning. It was too bad that he didn't have time to prevent that exodus last night. Without sufficient preparation and adjustments to Hogwarts owl enchantments, there was nothing he could do to prevent the events of the previous day from being disclosed by the students. That meant that Lucius Malfoy had fled the minister soon after his son's owl had arrived. Lucius had been a former lieutenant in Voldemort's Death Eater organization. The Death Eaters had been a true terrorist group, in every meaning of the word. A more misguided, ruthless, murderous, and evil revolutionary faction would be difficult to find. Today, though, Lucius was as a respectable citizen. He was well known as a patron of the arts, charity sponsor, and leader of the ultra-conservative dark political party in the Waisengamot, which balanced nicely with the light political party that Albus led and left a moderately sized group of unaligned that the other two sides tried to sway to their way of thinking whenever anything in the Waisengamot came to a vote. A nice stable system where nothing radical ever passed. Although Dumbledore did wish that he could pass several modifications to existing laws to ensure fairer treatment for new wizards and witches, and rescind several old laws that needlessly discriminated against other creatures in the wizarding world. Plus, there were many laws that needed to be tweaked to remove old prejudices and allow more opportunities to muggle-born wizards and witches, while still giving some preference to purebloods and half-bloods. While there were rumors that he dabbled in the dark arts, and owned many dark artifacts, the headmaster was sure Lucius had turned over a new leaf and truly regretted the misguided deeds of his youth. Back then, Malfoy had believed that pure BLD wizards were naturally superior to all other creatures and should rule the world with an iron hand. In his opinion, at that time, muggle-born wizards and witches should be exterminated at BRTH. The man had known nothing of either economics or breeding. It was such a relief to Dumbledore to know that the opportunity he had offered 10 years ago to Lucius to repent had borne fruit. Oh, yes, Lucius had said he was under the influence of the Imperius, but he never would have gained the status he had without a little subtle help from the chief warlock of the Waisengamot. A bit of a reward for his reformation. The wizard had reformed and now understood that there was a place in their society for the new wizards and witches. That they were needed to fill certain levels and positions in society, and to bring new BLD, no pun intended, to the wizarding society. That remaining hidden from the Muggle society was the best course of action. That trying to rule the Muggles would only end in disaster for everyone. The headmaster delicately took a bite of his toast while he waited patiently for Cornelius to continue. They are very concerned. They said that their children had sent them owls about necromancy at Hogwarts. Fudge gave Albus an outraged look. That some foreign students had performed a forbidden ritual and raised the dead. That creature was now wandering the halls of the school, freely, a menace to wizards and witches alike. Dumbledore swallowed his bite. Why, yes, Cornelius, the Gryffindor first years together, as a group did perform what some might term a necromantic ritual. However, it was not a forbidden ritual. Necromancy itself is not illegal, as you know. The old laws expressly allow the study of such things, despite my attempts to make it otherwise. And you know Mr. Malfoy believes quite firmly that we should keep the old laws as they are. He looked at the minister, eyes twinkling, knowing he had deflected the other wizard's attention from the Atlanteans. The minister had a confused look. He didn't know whether to be scared at the confirmation of the rumors, outraged that the ritual was not forbidden, or worried at what his largest monetary patron might say upon hearing that he, as the minister, had decried an activity his patron supported. Plus, if he supported the old laws, why had he complained to Fudge about what the students had done? The older wizard took another bite, chewed, and swallowed it. Under the old laws, as they stand now, it is forbidden to use a ritual to deliberately create a banshee, draugr, ghost, ghoul, inferi joncture, lich, mummy, phantom, poltergeist, revenant, shadow person, skeleton, spectre, vampire, white, wraith, or zombie. He took another bite and chewed as he raised his eyebrows at the minister. His eyes were twinkling, he knew. Fudge tapped one finger on the brim of his hat, and looked around the office. He took a sip of his tea. His hand shook. And what did these Gryffindor students do? He finally asked. The headmaster swallowed his bite. Do you remember a Miss Myrtle Warren, from your days at Hogwarts? Surprised at the non sequitur, the Minister of Magic frowned. After a moment, he said, No, can't say that I do. What does that person have to do with this? Perhaps you might remember her as Myrtle, gently prompted the headmaster. The frown deepened a moment, then Fudge said, surprised, oh, do you mean that horrid ghost in the witches' toilets on the second floor? Yes. Miss Warren has been returned to the land of the living by a previously unknown ritual, one which requires the presence of unicorns, and freely given BLD during the ritual from a unicorn. Dumbledore looked at the other wizard over his glasses. You know unicorns cannot abide by anything tainted by evil, or are impure in any manner, correct? He smiled at the stunned minister. I performed more than a few magical scans searching for anything that might indicate she wasn't what she appeared as, a normal 14-year-old witch with a severe case of acne. They all came up negative. He continued to smile reassuringly as he added, an unspeakable came over yesterday and gave her a clean bill of health. He chuckled lightly, at least psychically clean, that is. MDM Pomfrey already certified the young witch as being in perfect health. Except for a case of acne. He leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers together. She is not a banshee, draugr, ghost, ghoul, jonction, lich, inferi, mummy, phantom, poltergeist, revenant, shadow person, skeleton, spectre, vampire, white, wraith, or zombie. What she is a friendless, dejected, lonely, lost little girl whose parents have passed on and her siblings, and the rest of her muggle relatives, do not remember her. Myrtle was, at that moment, laughing uproariously at the red-faced reaction of the wizard she just had been flirting with. She had learned a lot about wizard and witch relationships over the last 48 years, 2 months, and 25 days as a ghost. And anxiously awaited her first opportunity to put some of the more physical of those lessons into practice, as she didn't mind telling anyone who would listen. She only had to wait a few more days. Yes, there were a lot of things she knew about wizard and witch relationships that she could barely wait to experience for herself. The young wizard's girlfriend was dragging him away by the hand while giving Myrtle a dagger-laced look that didn't terrify the newly reborn witch in the slightest. One of Myrtle's new dorm mates, a younger witch, was giggling at her side. The twins had changed their betting from when Myrtle would get laid, and with whom, to include how many wizards she would go through before the year was over. They even had a side bet on how many couples would break up over her and if she would pursue any multiple encounters. Harry could only shake his head at their antics. And he had thought the cutie mark crusaders were difficult to handle. Although he shuddered to think what those three would be like in a couple of years when stallions drew their attention. He did hope he wouldn't lose them as friends. Fudge leaned back in his chair. They brought a ghost back to life. The old wizard nodded. The ritual is of minor use, however. It restores the individual to the moments before the ghost was created, a minute or 2 at the most. He shook his head sadly. Few deaths are instantaneous, you know. Thus, if the person died moments after a stab to the heart, then that is what he will be restored as, someone with a stab wound in the heart just moments from death. A medical professional might save a poisoning victim, if he is there with the proper antidote and he acts quickly enough. The same could be said for drowning victims. But those who died from violence or old age will find the ritual of no use. He paused in thought. It might be of use in those cases where someone was hit with the avadakedavra curse, however. He nodded to himself. Yes, I shall suggest that to MDM Bones. The minster paled at the thought of that dreaded curse. He took a sip of his tea, his hand still shaking slightly. And an unspeakable examined her. Yes. His exact words, after all the scans he made, were, "She's just a girl." Pity, that. The headmaster chuckled. I do believe he was hoping for something a bit more exciting. Fudge took another sip of his tea, somewhat calmer, now, and sat thinking for a few moments. And what is this I hear that most of the Gryffindor first years are Animagi? Albus smiled. Actually, it's just 7 of the 14 Gryffindors, 5 witches and 2 wizards. There are the 3 foreigners, of course, Mrs. Bell, Alou, and Bloom. Then there are the 2 Weasley children, Mr. Ronald and Miss Ginevra Weasley. Then there is a Muggle-born, Miss Granger, and, finally, Harry Potter. He smiled smugly at seeing the minister's stunned reaction. Yes, I do believe this sets a record for Hogwarts. Never have there been that many confirmed Animagi in Hogwarts, much less in a single house. In fact, they alone double the number of known Animagi in the last century. He took a sip of tea to hide his smirk at getting into the record books, again. And to be first years, all, is indeed an accomplishment we shan't see repeated any time soon. In addition, Mr. Potter, and Mrs. Bell and Granger, are unicorn Animagi. Mrs. Weasley and Alou are Pegasi, and Mr. Weasley and Miss Bloom are what they call earth ponies. Fudge sat silent, eyes wide, too surprised to say anything. Harry Potter is a unicorn, he finally squeaked out. Dumbledore nodded. And the Weasley family has 3 other children who are Animagi. The twins, George and Fred are unicorns, and Percy is an earth pony. And their mother recently mastered the ability and is a Pegasus. Eyes twinkling, he added, plus, Mr. Wood and Mrs. Johnson and Spinnet, also of Gryffindor, are Pegasi. He relished the look of shock on the other wizard's face. The headmaster could see the minister mulling over the revelations. He was paying more attention, Dumbledore was sure, to the previous list of pony Animagi than the last 4 mentioned. He idly wondered when the wizard would realize that Gryffindor House had 13 students who had mastered the difficult art of becoming Animagi, almost 5% of the house. And almost double the number of registered Animagi. A record he was sure would stand for many centuries. He finished off the last of his breakfast. Fudge, he knew, was focusing on something else entirely. The Weasley family, while an old pure BLD family with more than a little political influence, was a bit of a laughing stock to the other pure BLD families. The Weasleys' poverty and liberal pro-Muggle-born stance had kept them low on the social scale. Their principled stands on light issues were well-reasoned to many, even though the others might disagree on details. Everyone knew that the Weasleys, when they took a stand, did so out of convictions and not because someone had bought, bribed, or traded with them to get their support. Not all, though, thought that standing on one's principles when one wasn't supporting the dark agenda was a noble idea. They regarded such stances as traitorous. Many dark-leaning families laughed at the Weasleys' many children and ridiculed them behind their backs. They openly called them BLD traitors for their support of Muggles and Muggleborns and considered their poverty to be well-earned. That both Arthur and Molly were personally well-liked among the other pure, and half-BLD families was of little consequence to the dark-leaning families. They only cared about the pure families that stayed true to their obvious moral and magical superiority to the other wizards and witches, not to mention, shudder, the Muggles. However, having 5 of the Weasleys' 7 children become Animagi while still in Hogwarts was astounding. Having 2 of them become Animagi even before starting Hogwarts meant the family was magically very powerful. Everyone knew it took years of study and careful instruction to accomplish such a feat and usually only succeeded when the wizards or witches were adults. A long, time-consuming process that most wizards and witches considered not worth their time. And yet, the Weasley children had done it before leaving Hogwarts. Plus, this accomplishment was despite the family's head of house's clearly pedestrian magical abilities. So much apparent magical ability in one family moved them far up the social ladder as desirable spouses. He wondered how long it would take for the news to spread that Molly, their mother, was also an Animagi. He wondered if Harry and his girlfriends could teach that skill to Arthur. If you're smart, with a bit of luck you can make yourself wealthy. But, no matter how smart you are, you can only increase your magical legacy by marrying into it. And wizards admired magical prowess more than money. As a result, in such cases, whether or not you were a pure BLD, half BLD, or Muggleborn made no difference, magical power trumped all. Which, in turn, once the word got out, made the Weasleys even more politically influential than before, especially when you considered their BLD status. More than a few would follow whatever Arthur suggested politically in the hopes of winning one of his children as a spouse for their children. Or, if they were playing the long game and willing to wait to see if this generation was just a fluke, one of their grandchildren. Then, when the word got out that the savior of the magical world, Harry Potter, was a good friend of the family. Albus looked out the windows of his office and smiled. He could foresee a pay raise in the offering for Arthur in the near future, as Fudge tried to buy his loyalty in the ministry. He expected that Percy and the twins might soon be receiving some attention from the old family witches who before now had ignored them as poor choices for a husband. Each offering a generous dowry to entice their prospective husband. In a year, perhaps only a few months if the Weasley parents could be convinced to accept a marriage contract, or their sons were enamored of the witch being offered by her parents, the Weasleys would be poor no more. "Well," said Fudge as he stood and picked up his hat. "I'll be sure to pass the word to those that matter that the rumors are wrong, then. That there were no forbidden rituals and that the unspeakables have already concluded their investigation into the matter. What an extraordinary achievement, bringing a ghost back to life." He flashed a fake smile at the headmaster. "Thank you for your time," he said. "I must get back to the office now, much to do, you know. So many details to governing properly." The headmaster knew that most Sundays Fudge spent his day lazing at home. This Sunday, however, he would spend talking with his sponsors, discussing how they could turn the upheavals to come in the political landscape to their advantage. He wondered how long it would take for the minister to hear about the phoenix that was now accompanying Harry Potter. No sooner had the irksome minister disappeared into the floor than it once again flashed green. "Headmaster," came the imperious and easily recognizable voice of Thomas Bulstrode, "may I come through?" Albus sighed. Yes, of course. The Bulstrodes were an old, pure BLD family going back to before the founding of the Wizengamot. While not dark, they supported many of the bills proposed by the dark faction in the Wizengamot. They also voted for many of the bills the light side put forth to moderate the political climate. Moments later, the wizard settled into an armchair and said, "Millicent sent me an owl last night about some foreigners using a necromantic ritual to return a ghost to life." He frowned darkly. "What are you teaching in this school, nowadays? And who are these foreigners?" Simultaneously, the flue again flared green and the aristocratic voice of August Longbottom, Neville's grandmother, came through. "Headmaster Dumbledore, are you there?" Dumbledore sighed again. It was going to be a long day. Harry thought the morning was going rather well. Myrtle was clearly having fun with her housemates, gauging by her laughter and the giggles coming from some of the others whenever he saw her, either inside or outside the castle. The Fillies, and the other Gryffindor first-year girls, had quite enjoyed their time with her in the hot tub last night, he had learned this morning. They had apparently spent most of the evening gossiping about her experiences as a ghost. Lavender and Parvati had been especially interested in the stories the ghost had to tell about the events and couples she had spied on over the years, and especially any gossip covering the previous week of school. Hermione had been disapproving of the subject matter, frequently steering the topics interrupting. Lavender and Parvati had insisted to what magic the ghost had seen and the things she had learned. Myrtle had bragged that no one alive knew the castle as thoroughly as she did. Not even the twins, she had added, giggling. She had promised to show the Gryffindors some of the secrets, to the Fillies' delight and Hermione's frowned worry when she told this to Harry. After breakfast, the Ravenclaws let it be known that they wanted a Quidditch rematch. This time, the Pegasi released a snitch, just to give the Ravenclaws a chance at winning the game. It was more like dangling a hope just out of their reach. The game ended shortly before lunch. The Ravenclaws had once more received a severe thrashing by the time the snitch had appeared. The Pegasi had a huge lead. The Gryffindor first ties were starting back to the castle when Harry stopped. He looked at Apple Bloom, and asked, "Have you ever tried casting a spell as a pony?" She looked at him, puzzled. "I'm not a unicorn." Ron, Ginny, and Scootaloo watched quietly. "No, I mean, with your wand." She looked at him a moment, frowning. Then she shrugged, "Okay." She pulled her wand from its holster, getting admiring glances from those students who only had pockets in their robes for a wand. She handed it to Harry, then turned into a pony. He held it out to her and she took it in her mouth. She frowned a moment and mumbled Lumos. Her eyes got wide as she saw the tip of her wand glow. A quick Nox put it out. She shot out red and then green sparks, and started jumping up and down, crying out, "It works, it works." In a matter of moments, Ron, Ginny, and Scootaloo were duplicating her efforts and soon were firing stinging hexes at each other, dodging, running, and, in Scootaloo's case, trying to strafe the others while flying. The other students watched, astonished. Professor McGonagall had never mentioned this possibility for an animagus. Once again, the antics of the Gryffindor first years were the center of all conversation in the Great Hall during lunch, even at the headmaster's table, although the headmaster himself was absent. Harry was positive that their head of house was going to be spending at least a few minutes later this afternoon testing to see if her cat Animagus could cast spells using her wand. Or maybe immediately after lunch. Professor Quirrell listened attentively and when asked, merely offered that if anyone else had made that discovery, they had kept it a secret. His stutter had made for a needlessly long wait for his complete answer. Professor McGonagall had said, the Animagus transformation takes everything the wizard or witch holds into the magic, which is why an Animagus transformation doesn't leave a pile of clothes behind, unless you're rather careless or dangerously distracted. And as no one wants to be without their wand, no one has experimented with leaving their wand behind during a transformation. Making things more challenging, most animals are incapable of speech, and nonverbal spell casting is difficult for many wizards and witches. That would discourage the very few wizards and witches that might have been interested in using their wands in that manner. Not to mention, she had drily added, that carrying their wand as an Animagus would have been a problem. Especially for those whose Animagus might have been a bird, reptile, or other small animal. The equestrians had looked at each other and quietly laughed. Ponies didn't have the vocal limitation, and they had created saddlebags an extremely long time ago. Small animals might have difficulty carrying a wand, but larger ones certainly didn't. Especially if they had bags or harnesses that could be fitted. And with the possibility of having a small wand holster to carry the wand on a leg while a pony. Outside of that bit of excitement, lunch was lunch, and Harry was pleased to see that Myrtle was enjoying herself and eating enough to feed his cousin and uncle twice. At least she wasn't weepy and depressed as she had been as a ghost. And the fillies were slowly adapting to the heavy meat and sweets diet presented by the house elves. Although the fillies, and most of the other younger students, Harry noticed, preferred the sugar-rich sweets to the boring meats and vegetables that also appeared on the table. But, then again, the ponies seemed to like a sugar-rich diet back home as well. Having never had the chance to enjoy sweets as a younger child, Harry hadn't developed as much a sweet tooth as a human and actually preferred the fruits and vegetables, although the treacle pudding had found a special place in his heart or stomach, that is. And then there were the muffins and cupcakes Pinky provided. The Slytherins were unusually quiet, however. The look some of the older wizards were casting at the Animagi were disturbing. Harry was positive he saw one wizard smiling and trying to catch Hermione's eye. Not that she noticed, being more involved with planning experiments with Ginny and mapping out how their pony forms could use magic effectively. The afternoon was spent playing a modified version of dodgeball. As ponies they used their wands to shoot color spells at each other. Harry and Sweetie Belle had some difficulty adapting to using their wands instead of their horns, which ended with them being tagged out a quite bit more frequently. ASN, almost immediately. Not only were any spells sent by their horns not counted, they had to concentrate harder to direct their magic to their wands, creating delays which made their reactions that much slower. Hermione didn't have that habit to break. By the time dinner rolled around, they were pretty exhausted. Both from the physical exercise and the magical casting. In addition, Harry, Hermione, and Sweetie Belle looked as if they had been attacked by a demented paint store. They had learned that ponies holding a wand in their mouth could cast spells, rather well it seemed. The Pegasi and Earth ponies were more adept at it, having had to learn how to talk while picking up and carrying things in their mouths that unicorns had used magic to carry. Plus, turning into a pony while holding the wand also worked at casting spells as a non-unicorn pony, but was very tiring and you had to point your leg at your magical target. But then again, some unicorns did that anyway back home. Or, at least, pointed in the general direction of where they were shooting a spell. Twilight did it frequently when she cast the teleport spell at someone or something. While tired, Harry did notice that once again the Animagi were the center of many conversations. If the Olori hadn't been already emptied, he was sure it would have been, again. Animagi that could use their wands was certainly newsworthy. As on other nights, most of the Gryffindor wizards involved themselves in arm wrestling, chess, and other activities that many of the older witches gigglingly called manly. It was a way to combat the deadly emasculating cuteness of the little ponies, claimed one seventh-year student. Those big expressive eyes, trembling lower lips, ears that just had to be scratched, and ever so soft tummies that begged to be rubbed, they were just too cute. Resistance was futile, but at least they could reclaim some of their self-respect with some manly activities. Others continued the marathon Monopoly tournament they had started a day ago with one of the ponies close enough for petting when the game became too intense. A new, and surprisingly popular, manly activity, was exchanging hexes, gradually increasing in severity until the loser declared he was giving up. The twins had arranged a scoreboard with hex-off rounds leading winners higher and higher until only one would survive. There was a lot of side betting going on. At first, Harry and Ron had resisted the witch's pleas. Then they had realized that it was rather soothing. No matter how displeased one might be with the day, getting a good combing/petting restored one to equilibrium. Plus, it felt just so good. It even seemed to help Ron get over his disappointment and anger at his little sister infringing on his Hogwarts experience. Harry had expected Ron to be the most vocal in resisting the witch's appeals, but he was usually one of the first to comply. The only qualification seemed to be that he wanted to be as far from his sister as he could get. The Pegasi found that human hands made preening their wings' feathers much simpler and quicker. And preening, itself, was a soothing form of meditation for Pegasi. Harry did notice, though, that there seemed to be a few witches from the other houses in their common room, sharing in the petting. No Slytherins, he was relieved to see. Yes, it was good to be a pony with so many willing slave servants. Friends, they were friends. Looking back, Dumbledore had only thought Sunday was a long, tiring, aggravating, and unpleasant day. Monday was worse. Far, far worse. Sunday had been mostly repetitious and boring in the extreme as he calmed frayed tempers and upset parents. The worst part had been dealing with the reporter from the Daily Prophet, Rita Skeeter. She had spent most of the interview trying to get him to promise her a meeting with Harry Potter. For the greater good and to shut her up, he had finally agreed to a short meeting next weekend. In exchange, he hoped, she would write a mostly truthful account of how Myrtle had been brought back to life. Without implying that everyone involved was a Dark Lord or Lady in training, of course. He had even given her what he thought was a wonderful quote. After telling her, it is not necromancy as we commonly use the term. In fact, it is about giving genuine life back to one who lost it, the exact opposite of what most necromantic rituals achieve, he had said. It is an extremely powerful healing spell that, unfortunately, has a limited application. However, using an ancient ritual, these children have shown that under certain circumstances, death, like broken bones and other physical injuries, is not permanent. He had considered telling her it was a ritual that seized a person moments before they died and brought their body forward in time to merge with the ghost. But then the Ministry would insist the unspeakables enforce the time travel laws. He shuddered at the thought of losing an entire first-year class of any house. Not to mention what the Atlanteans would do if the Ministry harmed their children. Yes, that was a can of worms he did not want to open. So, he had emphasized the healing part of the ritual when speaking to Rita, and hoped she would make that part the central point of her article. It was a faint hope. At least with the carrot of an exclusive Harry Potter interview in front of her, she wouldn't completely throw them to the dark side. Maybe he should have offered her chocolate chip cookies, too. He sighed. What a horrible day Sunday had been. On the other hand, depending on what Rita wrote, today might be quiet and he might actually get done the work today that he needed done. Maybe he could pretend yesterday hadn't happened. His flue suddenly burst into green flames. Headmaster Dumbledore. Are you there? Came the cultured voice of Stephen Macmillan. What's this I read about foreigners teaching our children unapproved dark magic rituals? Dumbledore slumped in his chair for a moment before straightening. "Why don't you come through, Stephen? I'm afraid Rita might be a bit sensational in her article. You know how she is." "I think I will." His head disappeared. A moment later he was wanding away the soot on his clothes. He looked at the older wizard gravely. "Good morning, headmaster," he said, nodding his head. The headmaster stifled his longing to sigh, and, instead, greeted the other wizard with a smile. "Good morning, Stephen. Have a seat," he said warmly, waving a hand at the armchair at the corner of his desk. "Would you like some tea?" Dumbledore could see that the rest of the day was going to be as bad as yesterday. He would have to put off notifying MDM Bones about watching the Dursleys lest they, in a fit of spite, mention magic and the wizarding world. This was not a time for people to start questioning his judgment. Not when Voldemort was attempting a comeback. He would need to make up a story for why the Dursleys knew about magic and wizards. One which wouldn't lead the Aurors to Harry, and reveal his mistakes. Or have to explain why the Dursleys might be inclined to expect him to rescue them in exchange for their silence on the subject. He couldn't afford to have his reputation tarnished at this point. Not now, not when Harry was at last attending Hogwarts and might need his political support to fend off wizards and witches looking to exploit the boy. Or maneuver him into a place where they could hurt him, either physically or politically. Perhaps he could leak that a phoenix had taken up with Harry, just as Fawkes had taken up with him so very many years ago. He could even imply that the bird was Harry's familiar, just as everyone thought Fawkes was his familiar. Coupled with the boy's unicorn animagus form, it would give Dumbledore a stronger position in the Wizengamot as his mentor. It would also lay to rest any rumors that the foreign witches were corrupting the boy. Yes, that would work out well. Between the power demonstrated in being an animagus, having a magical unicorn as that animagus, and having a phoenix as a familiar, as well, that would place Harry very high on the light wizard scale. Many of the politically undecided wizards and witches in the Wizengamot would flock to the light banner if he had Harry Potter's endorsement, with those bona fides, allowing Dumbledore to pass some of those laws that he had sponsored previously that had failed. Not all would pass, of course, but with careful planning the really important changes would make it through. With luck, it would move some of the less dedicated dark families towards being undecided. Things in the Wizengamot would still be balanced, just with a tilt more in the direction he thought England should move. He nodded to himself in satisfaction. Macmillan took that as permission to speak and began a tirade fueled by Rita's article. When he stopped to take a breath, Dumbledore interrupted. "Did you, perchance, bring a copy of the Daily Prophet? I haven't yet had the opportunity to acquaint myself with her article." Grumbling, the other wizard reached into his robe's pocket and pulled out the paper. He handed it to the headmaster and sat back to give him a moment to peruse it. The flue flared green again. "Headmaster Dumbledore. Are you available?" came the refined voice of George Turpin. He suppressed his sigh. It was going to be a very long day. And the letters from the owls returning from Saturday's mass exodus would be landing on his desk today, too, he remembered. The Parliament of Owls that Monday morning was impressive, to say the least, as almost every witch received a letter. And many a wizard received a message, as well. The First Highs were especially grateful that they had been practicing their shield spells. History of magic still had no replacement, so they spent their time revising their charms assignment and reading ahead by bookwalking. Which made charms itself almost tedious. Professor Flitwick didn't seem to understand that they all had quite thoroughly covered the material he was presenting and wanted to get straight to the spell casting. Still, the fact that half the Gryffindors managed the finite incantatum spell perfectly the very first time they tried it made the professor positively ecstatic. Never have I had so many students get the spell correct on the very first try, he gleefully declared. 2 points each. Harry grabbed Hermione's arm and squeezed it to keep her from blurting out that they had been using the spell almost daily back at the Weasley homestead for the last month. She shot him a wounded and upset look as he whispered, "Don't, he'll take the points back. Nobody knows we had permission from the headmaster, and people will be jealous." Somewhat mollified, she settled back in her chair, still glaring at him and rubbing her arm. Then she gave a small smile. She had never really had anyone get jealous of her abilities until she had started Hogwarts with her new friends. Well, jealous in a good way, that is, not being snide or critical of her in a hurtful manner. The other Gryffindors, and the Hufflepuffs, took heart at how easy the others had made it look, and the entire class was soon casting it correctly. Professor Flitwick rewarded their hard effort with an assignment-free night. A night which, Hermione declared on their way to lunch, they would spend studying ahead so they could do this again. The cohort was undecided on whether studying ahead or doing assignments would be more tedious. At lunch, the number of available bachelor wizards dropped more than little. Almost all the witches in all the houses had seen Myrtle's thoughtful looks at the wizards around her, and decided to strike first for the wizard they wanted. The creepy little smile she had while checking out the wizards at mealtimes had certainly helped in those decisions. Even Slytherin House sported a few less available wizards than the night before. How long those couples would last as couples was another thing entirely. But, in the meantime, there was an awful lot of snogging going on in the third-year cohorts and above. Myrtle, though, didn't seem to care as she skipped merrily to her classes and greeted everyone with a giant smile. She positively lit up all her classes with her exuberance and joy at simply living. Plus, she flirted with every wizard in sight and some witches, as well, causing more than a little consternation. The number of red faces she left in her wake was enlightening to those students who were smart enough to pay attention, and forced the twins to alter their betting system to include a few new options. The betting was heavy that by the weekend Myrtle wouldn't be as innocent as she had been when she first became a ghost in more ways than one. Transfigurations was another tedious class, with a lot of technical note-taking and warnings. Even the fun part was a bit boring. Now that they had all mastered changing a match into a needle, they worked on speeding up the process and making the needles fancier than before. For some reason, Professor McGonagall seemed tense whenever she looked at Harry and the fillies, as if she expected something to explode at any moment. Harry couldn't help but wonder if the headmaster had told her about the Cutie Mark Crusader's reputation back in Ponyville that Rarity had recited that first day at the Weasleys' farm. Or maybe he had shown her the letter from the princesses. Still, they were in her classroom, under her supervision. And this wasn't potions, after all. What could the CMC possibly do in her class that would cause a commotion? He stopped a moment and looked at Scootaloo's concentrated stare at her needle. Sweetie Belle seemed to be staring out the window, until Harry noticed the faint flashes of reflected light. On closer examination he thought he could see the stitched outline of a carousel forming up on the curtains. Apple Bloom was staring at the ceiling, apparently lost in thought. Then he noticed that she had acquired a box of matches from somewhere and was launching the finished needles at a wooden beam overhead. When he looked closer, he could see she was building a tiny wall of needles that formed her initials. He sighed. Who was he kidding? They were the CMC. They could turn anything into a disaster if given only a few minutes' inattention by the adults. He looked around the room carefully, checking for any hidden jars of sap or other things that could draw the attention of his herdmates and become a lesson in how to turn harmless objects into chain reaction disasters. Professor McGonagall looked even more nervous when she noticed him scrutinizing the room so meticulously. She began looking around the room nervously. In DADA, Professor Quirrell was intensely interested in the ritual they had used to restore Myrtle. His stutter was nearly unnoticeable. At least, until he discovered that the ritual required a unicorn to freely donate BLD during the ritual. Then his stutter returned with such viciousness that it was almost impossible to understand what he was trying to say. After class, Hermione declared, "He is one of the worst teachers I've ever seen. I can barely understand him, and his explanations don't make sense." The other Gryffindors, at least those who had had primary schooling, all nodded in agreement. "If we want to pass this class, we're going to have to do the work ourselves," she had concluded. As a result, the Gryffindors' late afternoon was dedicated to learning what their defense professor was clearly incapable of teaching them. They took turns bookwalking and quizzing each other. Being out on the front lawn in the warm sun was a terrible distraction, though. What should have taken them only an hour or so took almost the entire rest of the afternoon. Sweetie and Harry, who had the most experience with spell casting from living in Equestria, spent their time explaining and coaching the others. That and the Animagi wasted an inordinate amount of time chasing each other around as ponies trying to hex each other with their wands held in their mouths. Which was giving them an enviable familiarity with silent casting, as holding a wand in your mouth tends to make you mumble a bit. Such things didn't matter when you were carrying a bag or bucket. Not a good thing to do, however, when casting a spell. It only took one painful bang from the wand in their mouths to disabuse them of the notion of trying to speak the spell and chance muffing a word. Harry noticed Professor Quirrell watching them from a castle window for part of their animagus play. This time, he seemed especially enamored of the two Pegasi playing at aerial combat hexing. Still, they managed to cover the lesson that they were supposed to have learned in class today. They even managed to work ahead several chapters. Then they completed the class assignments from Transfigurations. At dinner, Harry was surprised to see that the headmaster looked just as tired this evening as he had yesterday. He didn't look tired as in physically worn out, but there were lines on his face and he seemed more subdued than his normal exuberant self. He had had a tiring day, it appeared. Harry wondered what he could have been doing to wear him out so much. Professors Snape and Quirrell both seemed amused at the older wizard, while Professor McGonagall didn't glare at him nearly as severely as she had been for the last few dinners. But Harry did see the headmaster give a startled jump when Professor McGonagall appeared to be talking with Professor Sprout. She was holding her cup in her left hand at that moment. Although, every time Professor McGonagall looked at Harry's end of the Gryffindor table, she appeared relieved for no reason Harry could discern. Except, perhaps, that her furs ties hadn't blown up anything today, hadn't broken any of the laws of magic, nor performed previously unknown rituals that should have been beyond their capabilities and understanding. Yeah, maybe she did have a reason to be relieved. On the other hand, there was still this evening. Professor Snape just scowled at everything while conversing with Professor Quirrell. Harry was relieved to see the back of Quirrell's head for most of dinner instead of him staring towards the Gryffindor furs ties as he usually did. Although, Harry did wonder at the wizard's apparent fascination with them. Why them and not the Ravenclaws or Slytherins? Dinner was almost complete when there was a flash of light overhead, and an irritated voice said, loudly, "Philomena. You brat." A voice Harry instantly recognized. Harry, and everyone else in the great hall looked up to see a purple Pegasus wheeling around in the rafters. A red and gold phoenix flew in front of her and trilled a short song that sounded a lot like laughter. It then disappeared in another flash of light. "Twilight," Harry cried out, standing and waving his arms. "Clear the table," he ordered the fillies, looking down briefly. They started grabbing platters and plates and shoving them aside. The twins had decided to attend lunch and dinner today, causing many people around them to worriedly recast their poison detection charms at periodic intervals as they ate. The twins whipped their wands up and quickly levitated the silverware, goblets, and plates down the table. And dumped most of their contents into their fellow Gryffindors' laps. Completely by accident, of course, as they quickly assured their dorm mates. Their grins while doing so did not convince anyone that it was as accidental as they claimed. Twilight had spotted Harry and glided towards their table, daintily slamming into the tabletop and sending cracks across its surface. She sighed and looked down at the table. "Cheeseburgers," she mumbled, embarrassed. She gave Harry and the fillies a rueful smile and rubbed the back of her neck with her right front hoof. "Still haven't quite got the hang of these wings," she said. The students stared at her in disbelief. It took a lot of power to crack a solid wood table that was thicker than their fists. She should, at least, have had sore hooves. Instead, she barely noticed. And they had never seen a unicorn with wings. She straightened, folded her wings, and cleared her throat. "Well, anyway, what's this about you materializing a ghost?" she said sternly as she fixed Harry with a penetrating glare. Standing on the table, as she was, put her slightly above him. At his hesitant nod, she smiled broadly and started walking in place excitedly, her tail whipping back and forth. Was it hard? Did it work the first time or did you have to change the spell matrix? Was it exhausting? How much of your magical reserves did it use? Did you do it yourself or did Sweetie Belle and Hermione Granger help? Did you use your wands? Were you ponies? Did you do it outside or inside? Did that help? Was she a recent ghost? How did she die? Were there any side effects? Have you tried it again? What did she think about it? Did she ask you to do it? Is she still here? Can I meet her and ask a few questions? I made a short checklist. A scroll popped out of one of her saddlebags and she held one end up to him. The other end of the scroll unrolled down to the table and then to the edge. Hermione jumped back. It fell to the bench seat, then fell to the floor, and continued to unroll across the floor until it hit the wall. Harry thought it must be at least 10 feet long. The crowd of students now around him were staring with bugged-out eyes at the alicorn. Well? Why aren't you saying anything? She demanded, stopping her trot to stamp a hoof, and spread the cracks in the tabletop. Where's Spike? Was the only thing Harry could think to say. If he had been here, the little dragon would have been trying to slow her down. He was about the only one not an element of harmony who could. Twilight rolled her eyes, and snorted. That brat, Philomena, didn't give me time. I had no sooner grabbed my saddlebags, and, poof, here I was. She lifted a hoof to stamp again, but Harry grabbed her leg. Ah, came the soft tone of the headmaster as the students parted to let him through. Princess Sparkle, I presume. The other head of house professors followed him. The alicorn spun in place to face him. Oh, Headmaster Albus Dumbledore. Harry could see her blushing. I'm sorry, she said, genuine remorse and embarrassment coming out in her tone. I wanted to send you a message that I was going to be coming tomorrow, but that brat, Philomena, Twilight rolled her eyes, surprised me and just brought me here, instead of taking the message. She narrowed her eyes and glared at where the phoenix had disappeared as she brandished her re-rolled questionnaire scroll in her magic. A trill of laughter seemed to hang in the air for a moment. The scroll flew into her saddlebags. By now, the entire hall was watching and listening to them. The students were somewhat familiar with the ponies, by now, but this one had arrived via Phoenix, whom she had loudly proclaimed a brat. She also had both wings and a horn. And the latest gossip spreading across the hall said she was an honest-to-Merlin princess. Most of the Ravenclaws were standing on their benches and the Slytherins had climbed atop their table. Yes, Dumbledore said, stroking his beard lightly. I dare say she surprised us all, he said, his eyes twinkling. I applaud your rapid transformation into your animagus form so you could fly instead of fall. Excellent reflexes. It was so fast, I didn't even see you do it. Twilight blinked. Oh, I didn't. Harry grabbed her nearest leg and squeezed. She glanced down at him. Ah, yes, she said continued, that's what I did. Harry was trying valiantly not to facepalm himself with his other hand. Well, then, the headmaster continued, perhaps you'd like to return to your normal form and we can discuss whatever brings you here. My normal form, she said uncertainly, then continued, oh, yes, of course. How silly of me. I was so intent on talking with Harry that I forgot to do that. Harry's eyes went wide with horror. From what she had said, she had clearly been in Equestria when Philomena had snatched her. He urgently grabbed for her leg, again, saying, wait. It was already too late. He was holding her ankle. Gah! Harry said as the entire rest of the student body gasped and stared in stunned silence. Twilight had transformed into her human form. There she was, standing on the table, clearly visible to everyone in the great hall. That she was only a hand's width shorter than 2 meters, and almost half a head taller than even the Weasley twins, made it easy for everyone to see her. Harry's mind went blank for a moment as he watched Twilight look around at the surprised wizards and witches, startled at their loud gasp at seeing her transform. He was relieved that, for once, she hadn't been too preoccupied with the immediate situation. Relieved that she had actually thought things out before she had transformed. Relieved that she had actually remembered all his lectures about wearing clothes whenever she wasn't in her bedroom. Harry knew she had removed all her clothes before she had returned to Equestria through the portal, as they all normally did. Plus, from her reaction when she arrived, he doubted Philomena had stopped by the portal to give her a chance to grab any clothes. Maybe he should suggest she keep a set of clothes in her saddlebags for the next time she was unexpectedly brought to Earth. With the undetectable expansion charm it shouldn't be a bother. She was wearing the form-fitting dress she had worn when they first came through the portal. A dress Rarity had quickly replaced with something more befitting her status and planned activities in this world. Only Harry knew the clothes were an illusion. He hoped. There were a few wolf whistles and a general noise of approval from the older wizards at her rather striking well-endowed figure. The witches, meanwhile, gave exclamations of disapproval or envy. And hexed their boyfriends, either current or new, for looking. Sometimes more than once. Myrtle, Harry noticed, was staring at Twilight with a rather strange expression, he thought. Harry sighed. He let go of her ankle and reached up for her hand. "Come on down from there," he said quietly. He guided her over to his side of the table and helped her keep her balance as she stepped down. As soon as she was beside him, he whispered, "That's not a solution, there are spells that let people see through illusions, like the ones on my glasses." He looked around the hall, again. None of the older wizards were acting as if they had learned that particular spell, yet. There was, of course, the spell to see through clothes. He was grateful that he had never turned on that particular feature in his glasses. He had no longing to see the headmaster or Malfoy's goons unclothed. The thought alone was enough to make him shudder. He had tried that feature only once, in the privacy of his own room, to see if it really worked. It did. Clothes appeared as a slight outline of the person being viewed. He wondered if there was an easy counterspell one could put on their clothes to block that spell. He would mention it later to Twilight. If the spell didn't exist, he knew she would be the one who could create one. And he would make sure the Fillies, as well as Hermione and Ginny, had that counterspell. And Angelina and Alicia, now that he thought of it. He was sure they would make sure all the other witches knew it. The Fillies were not helping the situation as they were clearly trying to stifle their laughter at the wizards, and their witches' reactions, and turning bright red in the effort. Twilight sighed. "Ah," she whispered back to him, "well, it'll do for now. Although it does seem so silly to be fixated on wearing clothes all the time." Harry sighed, "But it isn't to these people." He looked over at the Gryffindor chasers. "Maybe we can borrow something from one of the girls," he muttered softly. He had to get her out of the hall before she accidentally did something revealing. As the headmaster cast a quick reparo on the damaged table, Harry began to direct Twilight down the table towards the great hall doors. She, in turn, was staring at the ceiling. "Oh, my," she said. "That's quite a piece of spell work. I'll have to tell Princess Celestia about it. I'm sure it would look fantastic in the throne room." She stopped and stared intently, her lips moving slightly as she deciphered the magic she was studying. Parvati, having heard Twilight's deluge of questions, was already headed over to Myrtle at the Ravenclaw table. Harry just sighed, again, and, with the Filly's help, steered her down the aisle. The headmaster and deputy headmistress paced them on the other side of the table, at first, and then followed them bemusedly as Twilight kept her eyes on the charms in the ceiling. The other heads of houses started chasing the students back to their tables and restoring order. Harry's group had just reached the doors when the princess stopped, again. "Oh," Twilight said. "Where's the Filly girl who used to be a ghost?" She looked around the hall. "That would be Myrtle, here," said Parvati as she dragged the witch behind her, catching up to them. Hermione squeaked in surprise as the soft briefcase she had picked up off the table, the saddlebags had changed into a briefcase moments after Twilight took on her human form, suddenly flew open and a paper and quill flew out and started taking notes. "Oh," said Twilight as she studied the girl, frowning slightly as she scanned the Ravenclaw former ghost from head to toe. "If you don't mind answering," the Equestrian princess said, "were you surprised when you became a ghost? Did you want to become a ghost? How did it happen? Did anyone see it happen? How long did it take you to realize you had died? How old were you when it happened? Are you the same age now as you were then?" Twilight, Harry tried to interrupt as the professors and students who had followed them the entire Gryffindor first-year cohort plus a few of Myrtle's new friends listened in silence to the barrage of questions. Was it difficult to adapt? Were your emotions calmer or worse? When did you meet the other ghosts? Were they nice to you? Did you make any friends with the ghosts? Did you have trouble interacting with your former friends? Twilight. Harry repeated, looking around and giving their audience a hesitant smile. Myrtle had a look somewhat reminiscent of a deer caught at night in a speeding lorry's lights. How did your friends react when they discovered you were a ghost? Do you know how you died? Did you walk or float everywhere? Could you freely roam or were you restricted in some manner? When you disappeared, did you just turn invisible or did you actually go somewhere else? What did you think when Harry offered to restore you to life? Twilight. Focus. Harry hissed, yanking on her arm at the same time. Myrtle was starting to back away from the crazy witch in front of her. Twilight turned to Harry. "What?" She put her hands on her hips and scowled. Harry just glared at her. She looked at the crowd around them. "Ah," she said, dispiritedly. She dropped her hands to her sides and looked dismayed. "I did it again, didn't I?" She sighed. "Yes. Yes, you did. Now apologize." The student stared at Harry. He was reprimanding an adult. An adult who, it seemed, was a princess. The fillies just rolled their eyes. Blushing, Twilight looked at Myrtle. "I'm sorry about that. I sometimes get a bit overenthusiastic when I have a chance to learn something new." "You think?" Harry mumbled under his breath, making the fillies giggle. Twilight just gave him a quick, shirty look, before turning her attention back to Myrtle. "And at home we have nothing on real ghosts," she said. "So, please, will you answer some of my questions? It would help me ever so much. I'm sure we could easily get a whole book published out of it." A new book. She jogged happily in place for a moment, distracting the older watching wizards as her form-fitting illusion faithfully followed her BR-less movements. She looked at the girl hopefully. She gave the girl her rendition of the Cutie Mark Crusaders' begging cuteness of doom look. It wasn't nearly as effective as theirs, but the sheer novelty of seeing such a look directed at her from anyone, much less someone who towered over her, had the Ravenclaw nodding her in agreement. That, or it was merely her head following her eyes as she watched the princess chest bouncing. There was an awful lot of it. Twilight squealed in delight, hopping in place for several seconds. Harry saw that one of the wizards watching, a fifth year, he thought, had a nosebleed. The wizard hadn't yet noticed. The outraged expression on the witch standing nearby, and holding his hand, indicated that she had noticed her boyfriend's problem. Harry knew that expression from his aunt when she had caught his uncle eyeing one of the women on the telly a bit too closely. Dumbledore, who had been listening, spoke up, eyes twinkling. "Perhaps we can continue this in my office? We wouldn't want to distract the students from their studies, now, would we?" "Oh," Twilight said quickly, turning to face him. "I couldn't do that. You have much more important things to do than listen to me ask questions, I'm sure. Just show us to a convenient room and we'll be out of your way." The headmaster smiled at her. "I'm sorry, but unless you are family to the student you are meeting, either myself or the student's head of house must be present. It's for both yours and the student's protection." Twilight looked over at Myrtle and tilted her head slightly. "So, your head of house is?" Before the witch could answer, though, Dumbledore said, Professor Filius Flitwick is her head of house. He swept his arm courteously towards the short wizard. Professor Filius Flitwick, Twilight said, facing him. It is a pleasure to meet you. Harry has been most impressed with your classes. It will be a pleasure to speak with you. I am Twilight Sparkle. Princess Twilight Sparkle, Harry felt he had to emphasize. Yes, yes, she said testily and rolled her eyes. Princess Twilight Sparkle, she repeated. After a hesitation, she added, you wouldn't mind answering a few questions for me about your magic, would you? The dapper little professor clicked his heels together and partially bowed. Princess Sparkle, it would be my pleasure, he said with a smile. Harry noticed that the professor didn't offer his hand, so he must have assumed that wherever she came from, they did not shake hands. Or, perhaps, he thought that as she was royalty, shaking hands with her was inappropriate. She smiled back, a new scroll and quill floating out and starting to make notes. She said, please, call me Twilight, I prefer that. She turned to the other head of house. Professor Minerva McGonagall, a pleasure to see you again. The pleasure is all mine, I assure you, Twilight, was the quick response, with a polite head nod. Shall we proceed, said the headmaster, gesturing towards the great hall doors. Twilight gave one last look up at the great hall ceiling, and then started walking towards the doors. As they exited the great hall, Twilight said, so, Harry, was it just you, or was it you and Sweetie Belle, who did the spell casting? Pretty much both of us, Harry said. We were all there, that is, all the Gryffindor first years were in the room, but Sweetie Belle and I did the main part of the magic while Hermione was our backup and made sure we didn't forget anything or mess up. And Sweetie Belle supplied the drops of BLD at the proper time. Oh. This is so exciting. It's the first time any pony has had a chance to use that spell. She stopped and spun happily. Looking back, Harry saw one of the older students following them walk into the side of the great hall doorway. He couldn't repress his smile at the silliness of it. The witches all had their boyfriends firmly by the hand. It was only because Twilight was a princess and the subject matter was so interesting that they didn't drag their distracted boyfriends away for some remedial training in how to act around their girlfriend. Harry knew that hexing would be involved. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 22. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author tkepner on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video, till then goodbye. Sasasas.